So like,
Okay. Okay, cool.
of course,
Thank you.
yeah,
Thank you.
yeah. I know, it's funny because when my students watch it, they're like, I guess it was my what? And I knew it. Right. And I'm like, polar ice a lot, just like my own.
Turn back. We were listening to them for this. Before we even begin, Michelle, can you introduce yourself?
I can, yes, I have here.
Yeah.
Yeah, when you guys start, if you guys just want to hand it to me here, start.
Sorry?
I think so you guys are going to start off. So
Well,
hand it over to me. Or do you want me to
Yeah. Trisha, then you. And then after you do whatever you're gonna do, then introduce yourself, and then I'll be the next one.
That's awesome, yeah, that'll work. Yeah, I just
Anybody know? Yeah.
Back way back in the day.
You just posted on Facebook, right? I think I saw the post on Friday. That's sort of 50 years ago. He's doing okay.
It's like in my mind, he's still the guy in the baseball cap number.
okay, so we'll start reading. Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Trisha Martinez, and I come from a family of faith-filled believers. And so it is an honor and a blessing to say a prayer. Father God, sweet Jesus, Holy Spirit, I praise you. And I thank you for bringing us together today for this gathering. Lord God, most importantly, I thank you for your sacrifice on the cross, dying for our sins, rising again, and blessing us with the fullness of life through the power of the Holy Spirit. Lord God, I ask for a special hedge of protection over each and every person here and the families they represent. I thank you for placing us together and guiding us through all of our days, Father God. I ask that you just continue to equip us to get through this life, this world, and that you just protect our path. Be with our loved ones and all of those that couldn't be here today. We praise you and we just thank you. In Jesus' mighty name, amen.
Gracias, Trisha. So thank you all for joining us. I'm going to start with the poem I wrote over there for the exhibit. I'm the daughter of Jacobo Perea and Dominga Olguin Perea of Tecolotito y Delia, New Mexico, down between Las Vegas and Santa Rosa.
We can't hear you back here.
Oh, sorry. All right, I'll say it again. Oh, yeah, sure. Okay. I'm Dr. Patricia Perea, and I'm the the granddaughter of Jacobo Perea of Delia, New Mexico, and Dominga Perea of Tecolotito, New Mexico. So we're from the Vegas region out on the Llano Estacado. I did not grow up there though. I grew up in West Texas, just on the other side of the state line from Clovis, like my compadre here, Jesús. And my grandparents, sorry, I spent a lot of time with them, so I think of them as parents sometimes. They worked in cotton fields and in sugar beet fields over there as well. So I came back to Nuevo Mexico to get to know my family here in Santa Fe, in Tesuque, and in Albuquerque when I graduated from my undergrad degree. And now I teach in Chicano studies at UNM. So this is my poem, Manita Ritual. written for this exhibit. The clean smell of cedar can break the llano dust. Some days I smell nothing until she opens the cajita that has traveled, hidden in suitcases, stacked on truck beds as they followed roads from New Mexico to Colorado, to Wyoming, to Idaho. They were always going somewhere between here and there. Her polished nails click against tarnished metal. Click, then the creak of the hinge and the memories open, naked and total. There, a satin ribbon curled around a ringlet of baby fine hair. And there, a red and white tassel, class of '83, its threads thick and tangled. Look here, she picks up a newspaper clipping, irons out the wrinkles between her hands. I kept this, we remember this, it is ours.
Thank you all for being here. I'm really happy to see us all together here on a Saturday for such a special occasion. It's a real honor to work with this group of scholars. They've been diligently and heartfeltly collecting these oral histories from people from Taos County, and it's just such an honor to be able to share those stories here in Taos. So thank you very much for being here tonight. I wanted to thank our sponsors. We have two primary sponsors for the exhibition. The Northern Rio Grande National Heritage Area for the exhibition itself. Wouldn't be possible without them either. And also the New Mexico Humanities Council, who is sponsoring our entire humanities discussion panel series. And this is number 1 of 5 of these throughout the exhibition. And so we're also going to be traveling the exhibition, so keep your ears out. So we're hoping to get it to Santa Fe County and Rio Arriba County in the near future. And the exhibition here at the Millicent Rogers Museum runs through July 31st. I'm Michelle Lanteri. I'm the curator of collections and exhibitions here, and just on behalf of the museum, we're just so honored that the team here invited us as a partner for this project. I really love the journey, and the journey continues on, with you all here now. We're also joined by our friends at 90.1 Radio. Thank you for being here and recording. We're really honored that you're able to do so. So I just wanted to introduce our scholars here. So Levi Romero here, he is the co-director of the Following the Manito Trail project, and he's also an associate professor of Chicana and Chicano studies at the University of New Mexico. And then here to my left is Dr. Patricia Perea. She's a research scholar for the Following the Manito Trail project. She's also the director of the Manitos Community Memory Project, and also an instructor of Chicana and Chicano studies at the University of New Mexico. At the end of the table here, we have Dr. Trisha, Vanessa, Alicia Martinez. She is a research scholar for the Following the Manito Trail project. She's also the migrations manager for the Manitos Community Memory Project. And she's also a postdoctoral fellow at University of New Mexico Taos and the Southwest Hispanic Research Institute. And next to her is Jesús Villa. And Jesús is a graduate research scholar for the Following the Manito Trail project. And he's also a PhD student in the School of Transborder Studies at Arizona State University. And last but not least is Dr. Vanessa Fonseca-Chávez, and she is the co-director of the Following the Manito Trail project. She's also an associate professor of English and an associate dean of diversity, equity, and inclusion at Arizona State University. Welcome. So the first question, and we're going to go through a series of questions here, is can you please introduce the Following the Manito Trail project and its path to the exhibition here at the Millicent Rogers Museum?
Sure. Before we begin, I'd like to say first, so my name is Jesús Villa. my abuelo Jose Villa, who we'll probably be talking about a little bit more and who you can read about in the other room here, was a social organizer here in northern New Mexico for the last 30 years or so. He's part of the reason why we have the northern New Mexico National Heritage Area. He helped organize that. And he'd be muy enojado conmigo if I didn't acknowledge that we are on Tiwa, Tewa, and Toa land.
A little louder, please.
All right, so my abuelo would be bien enojado conmigo if I didn't acknowledge that we are on the land of the Tiwa, Toa, and Tewa people, also home to the Inde and Dine, and many other indigenous groups here who live here still, and are the first peoples of this beautiful land, and gave us the beautiful gifts of maíz, y calabacitas, y frijoles, todo eso. So we acknowledge and thank the ancestral peoples of this land. Ashkanto tlapalolis in Chiclampa Chaneki, in Chictlin Semanawak, in Way Mexico Aztlán, in Way Nuevo Mexico.
Gracias, Jesús.
A ustedes.
Gracias.
Yeah.
Santas y buenas tardes, les de Dios.
Buenas tardes.
Muy bien, qué bueno. The traditional Nuevo Mexicano greeting blessing. It's been shortened to buenas tardes o buenos días, pero los ancianos nos dicen buenas tardes, buenos días, simplemente dice el diablo, por no mentar a Dios. Going back to, I think, like around 2007, 2006, around there, I was a professor in the creative writing program in the English department at UNM. But before that, after I had gotten married, my wife was born and raised in Riverton, Wyoming. But originally her family was from Gascon, a suburb of Rociada. Yeah, and after we got married, she says, let's go to Wyoming so I can introduce you to my family, my relatives who I grew up with. So we went to Riverton, Wyoming, and while we were there, her tío and tía Emilio, Uncle Emilio and Aunt Helen Vigil decided to have a little barbecue for us in our honor, and they invited all their friends and relatives from South Park, which was known as the Barrio in Riverton. That's where the Manitos had all settled in that part of the state. And so they had this really beautiful gathering. And as I was experiencing the gathering, all around me were all these conversations and people and foods and customs and traditions that look just like home, meaning back here in northern New Mexico. I found that really fascinating because I had always imagined and thought of Wyoming as white cowboys and horses. And here was my gente alive and you know, viviendo, being who they were, preserving their traditions and their culture. And I said, wow, somebody should do a documentation on this. And then as the years went by, I was invited to different universities and colleges around Wyoming to do literary presentations. And I was always on the flyers, you know, New Mexico poet, writer, Levi Romero. And so the audience that would come to these presentations were primarily Nuevo Mexicano Manitos too as well. And I'd meet them afterwards and we'd be talking and they'd be sharing their traditions and how they had, or their families had migrated to Wyoming. And I was like, wow, somebody really should do a documentation about the culture of New Mexico making its way to Wyoming and surviving so far from its native homeland. Well, as some of you scholars here might know, that once you start saying somebody should do. So that's what happened. It turned out that then I did a study abroad, domestic study abroad to Laramie and Cheyenne to interview people, Nuevo Mexicanos, Manito people. And I took a group of 9-10 students with me and we spent a week in Cheyenne interviewing people. And then so we had the interviews, the students produced their manuscripts, postcards, really wonderful material. We shared it back with the people we'd interviewed. But then I transitioned over to another department, the School of Architecture and Planning. And I just dropped that project. I was busy just going off over into another program. And I left it behind thinking that, well, I'll get back to it someday. And as scholars, we all also know what that means. And then I get a message from this young woman who had just gotten a job at the University of Wyoming in Laramie, saying that she had found out about the project and if she could work with me on it. And I said, absolutely. And so here we are all these years later, and none other than Dr. Vanessa Fonseca-Chávez, who was the person who contacted me about this project. And I'll let her tell you about how she found out about it. But now it's been an amazing collaboration. We've got other collaborators here that are working with us here at the table and then in the back recording. Who would have ever imagined that from those conversations that I heard on that barbecue in Riverton, Wyoming, that it would lead to this? We already had one exhibit before at the University of Laramie, or Wyoming, I'm sorry, in Laramie, which was really focused more on the migration of people to Wyoming. But here we are today focusing on the Taos Valley. And so what I can see in the audience is this is a beautiful reception for this work. And thank you for coming. I'm sure that a lot of you, if not most of you, are here because the Manito migration is part of your own families as well. So this is a way to honor them, for you to be here, and to also collect the stories that you have in your own families about the Manito diaspora. And so with that, mi colega, Vanessa.
Thank you for the suggestion to stand up. I think we might be able to speak a little bit farther.
Now you tell me.
I love that. They wrote a note and they said, please pass it along. So let us out of this. My name is Vanessa Fonseca-Chávez. My parents are Jess and Vivian Fonseca. My mother is here. Right there. My family is from the Grants Gallup Zuni area, so my Manito Trail is a little bit different, though I've been able to connect with some really amazing folks. Robin, for example, who has some really great historic photos of Atarca, New Mexico, which is where my grandmother was born. My Aunt Chris is also here, so thank you, and my family for being here as well. So Levi says, you know, I found him at some point and asked him to do this project together, and I want to my Manito Trail started when I left New Mexico to go do my PhD at Arizona State University. And it was hard moving away from home. It was hard for the first time when I was 25 saying, I'm gonna go to a new state. It was very close. I only chose Arizona State because it was 6.5 hours away from Albuquerque. So it was not because it had a great program, it was because it was the quickest route home. And so I went to do my PhD, and I had been thinking about New Mexico, of course, was always in my heart, always on my mind, always how I could get back to New Mexico, and thinking about how from Phoenix, Arizona to Albuquerque always took me through my mom and my Aunt Chris's home. It took me through my home in Grants and Blue Water, and it brought me to my parents' house in Albuquerque. It brought me to my son, who's in the back. He doesn't like attention, but there he is. But thinking about these paths that always bring us back, and the kind of memories that brings for us, you know. And so when I moved to Wyoming, it was weird. I didn't know, Wyoming was never on my radar as a place to go, but again, it was the closest university I could get a job to New Mexico. And so that Manito Trail up I-25 was really long and snowy and trafficky, but I did it, we did it. But one of the first experiences I had in Wyoming was going to the Ace Hardware store in Laramie, and I don't know what I was looking for, but I saw this woman who looked like all the Gomez sisters in my family. And I was like, that woman could be my tia. And she had really dark hair, dark skin, salt and pepper hair. And I thought she looked like every other New Mexican woman I knew. And so I asked her where she was from. She said Laramie, and I said, oh, you look like you might be from New Mexico. And she goes, oh, I am, I'm from Mora. And she pulls the Mora accent out. And she says, I just got back, but I'm trying to get rid of the moch as fast as I can. And so it was really fun to see her as a first person. The director of my program in Wyoming was Cecilia Aragon, and she's also from Santa Fe. And so it was really nice to just connect right away with a lot of Nuevo Mexicano families, even though I was in Wyoming. And the more I wanted to be back in New Mexico, the more it led me to find Nuevo Mexicanos in the state of Wyoming. And so I was at a Chicano Studies conference one year, and I ran into Eric Romero, who's at New Mexico Highlands University. And he said, hey, have you ever heard about this Manito Trail project that Levi has been working on? And I said, no. And I said, where's Levi? And so I found him. And I think before I even said hello, I said, can I be on this project with you? And he said, yes. And so we've been co-directors of this project since 2015. And it's been a really wonderful journey thus far. We've had lots of really great funders who have believed in the project. So the Wyoming Institute for Humanities Research, the Wyoming Cultural Trust Fund, the Social Justice Research Center at the University of Wyoming. We had our first gallery exhibit in 2017. It mostly highlighted families from the Mora and Las Vegas area. That was at the American Heritage Center at the University of Wyoming. That was really beautiful. And I think for us, it was really nice to see families see themselves in an exhibit, to have their stories being told. So they came from everywhere in the state of Wyoming to see this exhibit. It was really heartfelt for us. And so what you see in the exhibit is the product of lots of labor for many years, because all of us as Nuevo Mexicanos have felt a really special connection to our families and our communities and our stories, and the way we travel and carry those with us while we go outside of New Mexico.
Hello, everyone. I am a product of the Manito Trail. I was born in Cheyenne. My maternal side is from the Sapeo Mora area, and my dad's side is from Valdez. I achieved my undergrad at the University of Wyoming. And I have to tell you that growing up, this is kind of like a side note, but growing up, my dad always promised me that one day we would live off our family land in Valdez, and we would have animals. And so that dream has stuck in my head since a child. Well, after my undergraduate, achieving my undergraduate degree, I had to decide on what graduate school to go to. And I had a few options. And my dad said a prayer. And he said, if Trisha chooses the University of New Mexico, I'm going to go back to our family land, where it was just the land. And we're going to build our dream home. And we're going to have our animals. And I chose the University of New Mexico. It was my first choice. In 2015, I had the opportunity to meet Professor Romero in the casita in Chicano studies. And he told me about the project. And I obviously was like, I'm from Cheyenne. Like, this is my family history. Of course, I want to join the research team. He gave me the interviews from those 2007 interviews he conducted up in Wyoming. And to my surprise, the first interview I listened to was the voice of my grandmother. And my grandmother loves to talk. She runs in the family. And she was telling all of our family stories. She was even talking about my recent graduation from the university, and how, you know, I had too many cumbias and not enough rancheras. With further research, I came across the 1982 Lakutura oral history project that is housed up at the Wyoming State Archives. And it was interviews that were conducted with 3 generations of relatives, people who migrated to Wyoming. And in that collection, I came across the voice of my great grandma Tita, my grandmother again, and my Nina Kathy. And so I've continued the research. My grandma has always been my favorite storyteller. But as I learned through conducting my own research, she is in fact an oral historian who is not only the star of my dissertation, but she shared highlights of our family's migration and sheep herding experiences with other scholars who documented the history. There is a wealth of knowledge embedded in the community memory, practice, and culture. And I am blessed to engage with the depth of these experiences as part of my research and now professional career.
Thank you, Trisha. And so another question that we wanted to talk about, how did each of you join this project, and what are your connections to New Mexico, if anyone else wants to elaborate on those that hasn't spoken?
I'll go ahead with the answer. Oh, right. It is so against my nature to stand up. Okay. So for me, it actually comes from Professor Romero también. I came to New Mexico, like I said earlier, to get to know my dad's family. And I started off as a graduate student at UNM because that was the whole point of being here. And I was talking about my grandparents and how I was raised so much with them, and how their house in Friona, Texas, just 10 miles from Clovis, their house always felt so different from any other house that I would go to. Like the accents were different, the food was different, like everything was just different. And when I would come here, I came to Powake to El Parasol for a breakfast burrito. We were on a family reunion in Santa Fe, and I heard the accent of my grandpa. And my grandpa had been gone for a long time. My grandma had been gone even longer. And I heard the accent and I was just like, whoa, this, to use my uncle's quote from the other night, I was telling Professor Romero, it was like a singing Spanish. They were singing their words. And I was like, oh, I know that. I know that accent. And I just started feeling like, you know, everything I have ever written, the poetry, the dissertation, the essays, has been from my grandparents and trying to figure out this memory and this link to this place. And so in the exhibit, well, right here, the reunion, I start off with what is home? I mean, can a place you've never been be home? And in my mind, yes, because that place was in my grandparents' house. They brought it with them from Delia, like I said, which is between Santa Rosa and Las Vegas. They brought it with them from Delia up to Idaho, where my grandma lost her first baby, down to Colorado, to the steel mill, to California, before settling in Texas. And all of my cousins, and this is why this project is so important to me, all of my cousins, none of them have any relationship with my grandma because she died way before they were born. So they have this sense of feeling completely apart from what we could have known about ourselves if she had been alive to tell them those stories. So in Austin, which is where they all are, they read the blogs, they look at everything we're doing because they're like, this is something we didn't know. And in Texas, and I don't think any Nuevo Mexicano in here will be surprised, in Texas, it's straight out segregated, like Eastern New Mexico, right? We were told, like, you don't belong here. You're a Mexican, you're a Mexican, you're a Mexican. And so for me, this project is a way to heal that trauma and remind us we belong here. This is our land in terms of we are this history, right? You know, our ancestors are indigenous, our ancestors are Nuevo Mexicanos. We belong here in this space. We don't have to be like relegated to the margins the way nobody should be. But that is what I think of with this project. It's healing. It's healing the trauma of the experience of having to leave home. So that's what drew me. Yeah.
Yeah, and Jesus, what about you?
So my Manito Trail was also a pretty winding one. So I was born in El Burque and then was raised between Las Cruces in the south with my parents, and then La Villita in the north with my abuelos. And so I like to say I was born in the middle and raised at both ends. But I came out to Arizona State University to start my my college education just around the same time that that Professora Vanessa came out. So I came out in 2007, and I believe you came out in 2008. But like, and we've been there, so pretty much exactly the same amount of time, but I didn't meet her or learn about the Manito Trail project until last semester, so last fall. And we were introduced by a mutual friend, and who said, hey, you know, so like I heard that you're studying New Mexicans and stuff, and I know one of those. So, so he introduced me to La Vanessa, and we got talking, and it immediately became apparent that this is a project that I belonged on, and as soon as I, you know, and like Patricia was saying, you know, about hearing your accent and everything. As soon as I came into the first meeting and everybody started talking, and Don Levi started talking in Spanish, you know, it was the first time in a long time that I'd heard like my Spanish being spoken, you know, and I almost started crying right there. And like there were a bunch of other very similar serendipitous coincidencias that just kept popping up, right? Everybody seems to have like these weird little kismet things, and so one of those was Profe Levi was saying, "Oye, Jesús, I think I have one of your dad's retablos. here. And I was like, oh, well, my dad doesn't make retablos, but maybe it was one of my grandmas, because my grandma's a santera who taught me the art. And so I was like, well, you know, hold on a second, I'll go get it. So he brings it back. And sure enough, it was one that I had painted. And I was like, oh. And so, yeah, just like a bunch of those weird little coincidences kept popping up, and it became clear that, like, yeah, this was a project that I was quickly falling in love with, and was very happy to be included on. So, yeah, that's pretty much it.
So I was wondering if you all would like to talk about identifying culturally as Manito and Manita. Could you all speak to that and how that continues to change through these different experiences?
I'm sorry, can you?
Oh,
Say
sure.
that again.
So yeah, if you all could speak about the way that you identify culturally as Manito and Manita, and how it reinforces community, and how it's changing kind of with your experiences. If Patricia, if you
Yeah,
want to
for
start.
sure. So for me, and I don't know if this happens to everybody else, but since I wasn't born here or raised here, you know, just in the confines of my grandparents' house, I was always very careful. I'm you know, I'm not a Nueva Mexicana. This isn't something that I feel like I have the right to say at all. But what my mother, who is from South Texas, would say is, you know, in the fields, because like I said, they worked cotton fields. So she would say, you know, in the fields, everybody knew Manitos were the Nuevo Mexicanos. Like they were, you know, not the Mexicanos, like the Tejanos, they weren't those, they were the Nuevo Mexicanos. And so, you know, sometimes it was pejorative, sometimes it wasn't, but she knew about this like distinction. So when Professor Romero was saying, you know, you are Manita, and I'm like, I don't know, like I want to be, but I don't know if I can be, because I don't want to like appropriate anything.
Been drafted.
And then the more and more I read the work that Dr. Fonseca-Chávez was doing, the more that I read about the project, I was like, well, you know, my grandparents were going everywhere. And like I said earlier, they were taking their cultura with them, but they were also raising us, not just to be proud of who we were, but to just like know even our history, right? Like I said, to know we existed. Because in Texas, there are no Pereas, like none. Like we were always the only Perea. They mispronounced our name all the time. And so when I came to New Mexico, I'm like, there are Pereas everywhere. Oh my God, this is amazing. Maybe I'm related to them all, which is why you can't really date in northern New Mexico. But I was like, you know, who knows? Like, this is amazing. So through really, I almost want to say the therapy of working with Professor Romero, I was like, okay, I think this is something that I can at least identify as part of my experience. So that's how it works.
I'm a therapist. Anybody want to sign up?
Trisha?
Yeah.
So my grandma has always emphasized that we're Hispano and not Mexicano. But in Spanish, somos mexicanos de aquí, pero no de allá. Growing up outside of the state of New Mexico, I was unable to recognize this distinction because I felt connected to the culture and community of my compañeros mexicanos. My Nuevo Mexicano heritage is distinguished and complex. The legality of geographic borders, racial politics, and nation building initiatives all played a significant role in identity constructs. I identify as Hispana, Chicana, Nuevo Mexicana, Latina, and Manita. As one may be able to perceive this contradiction, the interchangeability of these terms accentuates their fluidity. My identity as Manita is rooted in my familial ties to the Norte. It's enjoying a cooked meal over the fire of a wood stove or a meal around the Primo's table. It's snuggling up in a homemade quilt gifted to you, warmed by the familiarity of the blankets at my grandma's house. It's connecting to the music of the Sparks because those were the cassettes my dad would always send to us, me and my sister, so that we can stay connected to Lakutura. Soy Anita de Wyoming.
Mine will be brief, I think, but ¿me oyen? ¿Me pueden oír? ¿Sí? Can you hear me? They can hear me in 2 languages. Yeah, for me, I'm born and raised in Embudo. Down the road, I never went on the Manito Trail like some of my colleagues here. I was born and raised, my querencia is in Dixon and Embudo. But my relatives were on the trail. On my mother's side, my aunt and uncles wound up in San Jose working in the canneries. And as the stories that they tell me is that there were a lot of people from northern New Mexico working in the canneries in San Jose, a whole group of them. I've heard stories also about a whole group of people that went to Oakland from Taos, that settled in Oakland, and in that community, it was known as Little Taos in Oakland. And so on, all throughout places throughout the Southwest that the Manitos recognize as their adopted homeland, right? Their new querencias. In Dixon, after the young men graduated from high school in the 50s and 60s, the question was, ¿Qué vas a hacer ahora? What are you going to do now? And the response was, pues, pa Califa, Utah, Califa, o el Army. Those were their options, Utah, Califa, o el Army. And in a conversation that Vanessa and I had with Dr. Anselmo Ariano, a great also contributor to this project, he was telling us that, in fact, Laramie could have been Laramie. So it's just funny the way, you know, people use language and what it means to them, and they personalize it. I think one of the beautiful things, what you notice, if you haven't noticed already, is the emotion. Because we're scholars, that's what they call us. We're not really scholars at Perea anyway. We play one at the university. But as scholars, you know, we don't assume our biases in the work that we do. We make room for everybody, whether they agree with the Manito term or not, right? We make room for those too as well. But we don't bring our biases into the research. But the difference with this research and other kinds of projects that scholars work on is that this isn't a documentation about somebody else's culture, somebody else's people. This is a documentation about our own families, our own gente. And that's the emotion behind this. When I look on the wall over there, there's a photograph behind the gentleman there. That's my grandfather as a borreguero, right? So that's the attachment that I have to this project. My grandfather, who was a borreguero in Creed, Monte Vista, Colorado, who died in that ranch in 1945 on the day that World War II ended. He received news that World War II had ended, and all his sons, my father and my 2 uncles, were in the military in World War II. They came back highly decorated, Bronze Stars, Purple Hearts, and todo. He took off his hat and he threw it up in the air. And by the time the hat hit the ground, he said, ahora sí, ya vienen mis hijos, and he died of a heart attack in a sheep herding ranch in southern Colorado. So that's the story. That's the attachment that we have to following the Manito Trail. Thank you.
So the question of identity has always been a tricky one for me, just like Doña Trisha was saying. So my bisabuelos, I might not look like it, but my bisabuelos and my abuelo were indígenas. They were Chichimeca and Nahua from Guanajuato, Mexico. So I like to say I'm incognijo. And they came up during the in 1915 to escape the Mexican Revolution, and so, you know, similarly, like I didn't quite feel like I qualified as a Manito because, you know, we were Mexicanos who came up to settle in Clovis, picked cotton and broom corn and worked on the railroad. But you know, I had these great stories from my tío abuelo Jesús, my tocayo, and one of my tíos abuelos, tías abuelas. about, anytime that they would meet, I knew when they would meet a Perea or they would meet a Torres or they would meet a Martinez, they would ask, "Es Chicano, Mexicano, or Manito?" And so like even then there was that distinction of like, okay, hay mexicanos de allá, hay mexicanos del norte, y mexicanos de somewhere in between, right? And so that's kind of how I felt about it. But the fact of the matter is that the Spanish that my abuelo spoke and that my dad spoke and that they spoke with me and I spoke was Nuevo Mexicano. When I went down to Zacatecas and to Mérida in Mexico to live and study for a while, I would speak Spanish, assuming that like, oh yeah, somos todos mexicanos. I'm gonna understand and be understood. And as soon as I opened my mouth, they were like, ¿qué está diciendo? And it was little things like, like, oh, pues voy a poner el libro para atrás. I'm gonna put the book back. Like, ¿qué? Voy a ponerlo para atrás. O vas a regresarlo. You're gonna return it. Pues, okay, fine. Yeah. Or, cooking. It's like, ¿dónde está el baking powder? ¿El qué? Pues el polvo que usas para hornear. Ah, polvo de hornear. Oh, you want baking powder. But aquí es baking powder, no? So, and little things like that. Coffee grounds or kunques, which comes from the tewa. And so and little things. So this project and coming across it was also very healing and very therapeutic because it was very affirming that I didn't have to be either or, right? I've got used to being ni de aquí ni de allá. There's the famous, scene in the Selena movie, right? You're not Mexican enough for the Mexicans and not American enough for the Americans, and it's exhausting, right? And it kind of felt that way too. It's like, well, I'm not quite Manito, but I grew up half my life aquí mero in La Villita, just north of Alcalde, just down the road from Embudo. And so it was like, well, maybe I'm not ni de aquí ni de allá, but I don't have to make it an either or. I can be both and, right? I am both Manito and Chicano. I identify as Nuevo Mexicano, Chicano, and increasingly getting more comfortable with being Manito. My abuela taught me how to be a santero and make the retablos and carve the bultos. I learned that Spanish. I became a curandero in the tradition of my family, but a lot of my training happened here in northern New Mexico. So my curanderismo is puro Nuevo Mexicano, or más o menos. I also obviously incorporated lots from Arizona and Mexico. So yeah, this process of identifying as Manito and Chicano and Nuevo Mexicano and Gringo on my mom's side has been a very healing thing of you can sit in that complexity, you can sit in that multi-layered place of being, and so I'm very grateful to my team members here for bringing me into the fold and helping me discover myself again.
Thank you. And so can you all also talk about the significance of the family's oral histories and the themes that emerged during the interview process and how the exhibition is kind of taking form in our current moment?
I can start with that. So the very first oral history interview I ever did was with my Nana and my Tia Luisa, or my Tia Luisa. I couldn't say Luisa when I was younger, so she was Luisa. So I was sitting at their table, at my Tia Luisa's table in Milan, New Mexico, and I knew it wasn't a good idea to put them together because I wouldn't be able to hear the voices distinctively. They would just kind of mesh. And my Tia Luisa always had more to say than my Nana did. And so, but I sat down and I talked to them, and this was for a Spanish class that I took many years ago for a sociolinguistics class. And some of the themes that were brought up in that interview were the same things I keep seeing in all of these other interviews. And, I was asking them, I said, ¿Cómo llegaron los gringos a Tarque? And my Nana says, Pues no sé. I think they were on their way to California and they got lost, so they stayed here. But one thing she said was, we were sad that they never learned how to speak Spanish. So there was the expectation that when the Anglos were moving in, that they were going to adapt to Hispano ways, and it didn't actually turn out that way. It was the opposite. So the town that my grandmother was from, Atarque, is now a ghost town in northwestern New Mexico, because there were Anglo settlers that came in who had a disdain for Mexicanos, likely that they brought from Texas. So there was a lot of deep-seated resentment in Texas. They brought it with them to that area, and they created other schools and other stores, and they sort of took over. And that led a lot of Mexicanos in that area to migrate. And so they left to Eastern Arizona, or they left to Gallup, or they left to other areas. But the point is they had to leave home, right? And so I think that's a really, one of we never really talk about an identity in my family. And I think it's interesting because I've never asked my mother, how do you identify, right? And I didn't realize I was Chicana until I was about 24 years old, when I was at the University of New Mexico. But my Nana did say in that interview that day, I asked her how she identified it. She goes, I guess I would just be a manita. And it was one of the first times I had ever heard that word, and I didn't know what it meant, but it gave me validation to say manitos were in northwestern New Mexico too. They were in the New Mexico-Arizona border. And so the more we started conducting interviews, again, these same themes started coming up. People had to leave their home. People had to carry various elements with them. These interviews, it's interesting because the IRB process, so as researchers, we have to fill out this form, says that we're going to do this. What is the risk to the interviewee? It's very awkward when you want to just have a plática or a conversation with someone and you're like, but wait, there's this form that we need you to sign. And they're like, what does this mean? I'm signing my life away to the University of New Mexico or the University of Wyoming. And it's hard to come back to that plática and that storytelling environment after you've said, please sign the documents, right? Because we all know how we feel about signing documents from governmental entities. And so, but the conversation starts and the IRB suggests that you have a list of questions. No plática I've ever been in has a set of questions that guide what you're going to be talking about that day. And so I think a lot of the themes are themes that people just want to talk about, right? It's not themes that you necessarily want to talk about. And I've learned that you can't say, what were the dichos that your grandma used to tell you? And they're like, you learn those in context, right? You pull those from the conversations that are being had. And so we hear mostly about migration, about language, about discrimination, about the reason why so many manitos were in the south side of all Wyoming towns. And so these are common themes that we hear. In the span of 6 or 7 years, we've conducted about 50 oral history interviews with folks, ranging from 30 minutes to hours, as we're following them along with the recorder while they're walking down the streets, telling us so-and-so lives here and so-and-so lives there, singing songs, asking us to partake in a cup of coffee before we start the interview. So these aren't like 1 hour structured interviews necessarily. They're multiple hours, and we come back and we think about them often. I have the stories, when Liana says, "Hay frijoles en la casa," as part of her interview, and you'll hear them through the listening sessions. But you start to you remember those stories of your family too, and how similar they are, right? So we all share these stories, and I think storytelling is tremendously important. And it's important to go back to that kind of like Resolana dialogues that we used to have, right? Where you just sit and chat with people and you get to know them and you hear their stories. One of the most powerful ways I've heard those stories is through the pilgrimages for vocations that happens with the Archdiocese of Santa Fe. Levi Romero back there is the first one to have ever invited me to be a part of that. But what I love the most about it is walking with women and hearing their stories. Those aren't recorded, they don't go on record, but they're really beautiful.
So in terms of the significance of oral histories, one thing that was really powerful is, this is an area of US history and our history that has not really been studied very much, right? It's only fairly recently that we're getting a lot of, getting any attention on manitos after the colonial period, right? And the movement out and from and to New Mexico. And so just hearing these stories and collecting these stories and transcribing them was powerful, because oral history tends to get treated as lesser than written history, right? And there's a famous saying about history is written by the victors. But here, there weren't victors or losers. It was just hermanitos and hermanitas, sharing their stories, the way that they remembered and they wanted to, right? And that power of reclaiming your own story is tremendous. So that was really a beautiful and powerful thing. And then in and of itself. And then when it came to the content, you know, some of the major themes that came up, like my profesora was saying, were similar struggles that people encountered, excuse me, in terms of finding work, identity was a big one. The Mexicanos de aquí o de allá, or, you know, some families very specifically identified as Hispano and not as Mexicano, and others said, well, we're Mexicanos, but just a different kind, you know, or something entirely different. You know, like I had a tia abuela who, despite being indigenous and born and raised in Nuevo Mexico, felt a lot of conflict about being associated at all with indigenous people or with Mexicanos, because it was an unpopular thing to be in Clovis and West Texas. So she said, oh, you know, we're French or we're Spanish or we're Italian. And she's like, she looked like La Malinche. Like, ¿cómo que eres francés? What are you talking about? And so, you know, que en paz descanse, you know, she came to peace with our family and our identity and everything. But that was something that I read that we encountered a lot in these stories, was wrestling with and coming to grips with or accepting or being proud of this unique identity. I think another really powerful theme that I came across was the genius and the brilliance and the ingenuity of Manitos, right? Again, this is something that we tend to be characterized as campesinos who aren't educated or who are ignorant or, you know, are just simple folk, right? And there's power and beauty in being simple, but generally we're talked down about, right? And so contrary to that, what we came across in all these stories are these tales of incredible resilience and creativity and ingenuity. When work ran out, how you found new work, how you used your social networks, how you used compadrazgo, you know, kinship networks to find new work and new places to live, and not just live and survive, but to thrive, including in places that actively wanted to stamp out our existence. That was, and the resilience of keeping your language alive and keeping your religion and your art forms and your comida, like all of this stuff, the colcherismo, that continuity and that deep pride in la querencia, in the place and the space that defines you and your family. That was really beautiful. So obviously it's been a long history that needs a lot more research and uncovering, and there's a lot of painful chapters to it, and there's a lot of beautiful chapters to it, but overall what's been really powerful and gorgeous is just the strength and ingenuity and brilliance of our people.
Thank you so much. And we have a question from Juanita Lavady, who I believe is watching on Zoom. And so I want to honor this question and just kind of add this to our questions here. So for the team, how do you see the term Latino fitting in with the other terms, Manito, Chicano, Mexicano, Raza?
I can speak to that if con el permiso de mis colegas. So obviously this is these terms, right, can be very contentious. And so I want to honor the fact that there's a lot of difference of opinion on which terms you use, which terms should be used, and how we apply it to different people, right? In my opinion, how you want to identify is yours. Nobody can take that from you. What becomes difficult and problematic is when you apply a label to somebody else, whether they want it or not, right? So the term Latino was introduced by a French noble during the occupation of Mexico by France. And he wanted to combat, you know, the ability of like other colonial powers to, he wanted to make sure that like France could keep control, right? And so like, okay, well, how do we get Mexicanos and Manitos and all these different people to be okay with being under French rule? I said, well, we all come from Latin, from the Roman kind of background, so we're all Latinos. And it was kind of a way of like grouping everybody together to further French rule, right? So some folks are really unhappy about the idea of Latino, Latinx, Latine, to be gender inclusive, because it does come from a place of whiteness, of white colonial European power control. Similarly, like Hispano, Hispana, you know, puts the emphasis on Spanish background, so whether or not you identify with Spain. Chicano is more like trying to like reclaiming indigenous identity. So Manito does fall under the kind of broader umbrella of Hispanic for its ties to Spain. It falls under Latin with the broader ties to Latin-speaking people. So like it's all connected, but depending on, you know, your orientation and what heritage you want to emphasize or connect with. Manito can be distinctly pushing back against Latino, or it can be pushing back against Hispano, or it can be like within that community. So, you know, just like Doña Trisha was saying, it's complex, right? And it's not an either or, and we can sit with that complexity and with that complicated history.
And we are getting to about 5 minutes too, so I wanted to ask, does anyone here have a question for the scholars or someone in particular? Can I say something?
Oh, of course. Right. But before we get to questions, I just want to say, because I noticed her in the back. So I want everybody to look at these beautiful panels, all these lovely designs, the placemats that are over there. Lily Padilla is back there, and she's one of the people who designed all of this. Is Natasha here? I can't tell, but go ahead. Everything we're seeing in the exhibit, so I just want to make sure that you shout out to them because they have done amazing work for us these past few months. So anyway.
Thank you, and your question, go ahead.
I would like to make a presentation, if you allow me to,
Oh.
on the issue or the question about the origins of language and changes in language in northern New Mexico and the distinctive Spanish that we speak. And also I have a critique of the use of Manito and things like that, if I may.
So, do you have a question?
That, Dr. This great panel of professors and poet laureate, Mr. Levi Romero. Anyway, I think I could enlighten some of the history of the changes in the language and the ultimate use of Manitos as is being created by this group of great scholars here.
So thank you. So we would definitely love your contact info, and if anyone would like to respond, go ahead.
Dr. Martinez.
Whoever you'd like to respond.
Oh, real quick, before we went there, I was just gonna respond to the last question. So with all that said, right, from all of these stories and experiences, what I have learned is who we are. I continue to learn who we are as a people and how our prayers, energy, familial and community contributions surpass limits of time. I recognize the significance of our history and the value of life that we have been given. I perceive how our trails of life and the various pathways people journey to survive interweave and intersect at particular junctions, and most often in more ways than one. Stories of human movement and community illuminate the very qualities innate to our being, a people's hunger to survive, the value of connection, and the importance of our cultural heritage and traditions. I also recognize the sacrifices made by our elders. Our grandparents wanted a better life for their kids, and that trickled down to our parents wanting a better life for us. It is the beauty of cultural wealth to inspire the next generation, to remind them where they come from, and to keep them connected. Gracias.
I have a very quick question.
Go ahead, yeah.
The valleys around here, the men from the valleys all over our area, including my father, went to Wyoming to herd sheep, and they'd be gone for a year or 2 years at a time. I was never aware that whole families moved there. So these were men who took their whole families to go herd sheep.
Yeah, so I can respond to that one. So when I started doing research for this project, I first started at the Center for Southwest Research. This is at the University of New Mexico, and looking through census records, which showed that in the 20s and 30s, there were a lot of single men from Wyoming or from New Mexico rather, who were going up to sheep herd. But then by the 30s and 40s, there were multiple families moving up to Wyoming. So some of them were taking families with them and establishing themselves in places like Riverton, Rawlins, Cheyenne, Laramie. But many of them still continued to come back and forth. So it's a mix of men who went and came back while their families stayed behind. There's a really great oral history interview in the collection about a woman who waited a couple of years for her husband to come back. And her husband was coming back, and he says he's walking down the road and he sees this gentleman, and he says, "Oh my gosh, my wife went off and married somebody else." And it turns out that that was his son. He had been gone for so long, and she was pregnant. So when he came back, he met his son for the first time. And it's a really beautiful story, but there's a lot of data that shows, single men going up first and then families soon following.
I see. Yeah, okay, thank you.
Can I answer real quickly? I know I would like to make sure that there's time for a little bit of time for people in the audience who want to contribute a couple of statements or add to the story, right? But in my wife's family, to add a little bit to what Vanessa is saying, my wife's grandfather, Valentin Rodarte from Rociada, wound up in Riverton. He wound up working for a sugar beet company. And after working there, he then came back to Rociada in the company truck with, of course, somebody from the company driving, but they came back to Rociada, to Gascon, to pick up the family. And so when they came back to Gascon to pick up his family, the rest of the community said, "Nosotros queremos ir también." And so half of the community then loaded itself up on this big flatbed truck and wound up in Riverton. And one of those families was Antonia Apodaca's family, the noted musician, Antonia Apodaca. And so that was part of the migration pattern too, is how people got to these other places where they eventually made them their home.
Levi, was there a photo of Antonia in that?
I'm not sure if there is or not. There might be. But
I think there is. I didn't see that. You mean in there?
So I want to just add, one of the last questions that were asked of us is, how do you approach the exhibit around you, right? So y'all are here listening to the presentation, but soon we'll disperse. There's the gallery here that you're standing in, and then there's a second gallery here. What you're going to find in this gallery is the families that have been, that are part of this migration path. Some of them are here today. Bonavita Quinto's in the back. You can read about her family. Other families are here as well. So this room will tell you a little bit more about the families and their migration stories. And then in this room here, there's a couple of different things happening. There's some stuff for kiddos over here in the corner from the Monito's Community Memory Project, poetry provided by and written by Dr. Patricia Perea. You'll have a couple of just kind of definitions of different themes that we thought were important to mention. Items from the permanent collection at the Millicent Rogers Museum, which were meant to kind of complement the exhibit itself. There in the back corner in that nicho are photos of arbor glyphs, so carvings that sheep herders from New Mexico left on aspen trees in the state of Wyoming. In these two booths over here, and this is Trevante McLean and Vanessa Reinaga, who are the geniuses on this project, you can listen to the oral histories from some of the families. And so feel free to sit down, take a listen, and then you'll find family objects as well in the other room. Over here is a set of books. You can pull those items off the wall and you can kind of look through the ways that different authors have spoken and written about Manito communities. So there's a lot to take in. We also have some food, I think, just out here. If you're hungry, as I imagine you might be. And I think it's very typical, right, as normal Mexicanos gather to share food, share stories, and to continue the plática as you're walking around the rooms.
And can I add this one thing? But I'm sorry, I don't know your last name.
My name is Vargas.
Vargas. Okay, Senor Vargas, what I wanted to say is for the Manito Community Memory Project, we have a blog I would love for you to contribute. If you would do that to do the definitions there as well. That would be great
I
to
have
have that
studied all of
conversation.
them, including Dr. Martinez's dissertation and revised extensive writings, and I'm familiar with the whole process.
So if you would contribute to us, that would be great if you would like to.
I would like to make a presentation here that gives a little bit more context on the evolution of language and how distinct the language changes in northern New Mexico are akin to the patois, for example, of the Cajuns, if I may.
I don't know about time because we have a
Well,
question.
anybody can say if they want.
Let's pick up this question.
Yeah.
Yeah, so let's get your question. You've been so patient.
Don't have a question.
Oh, okay, yeah, whatever you'd like to
Quiero
say.
decirles muchísimas gracias
Oh,
por esta presentación y que ustedes siguen estudiando, documentando toda esta información de historia tan importante. Les doy las gracias que han seguido estudiando y con esta presentación espero que sigan. I want to thank you for being here and giving this presentation, sharing it with us all. And I hope that you will continue studying and you will continue documenting the richness of our culture. Muchísimas gracias.
I'm here representing Northern Rio Grande Heritage Area. In a little while,
yeah, and so we're gonna close out. Let's turn it to
Michelle, I
Karen.
would just like to kind of bring some closure to the comments
Thank you.
on
Yeah.
the Zoom. So again, from Juanita Lobby, she says, thank you. Good to know the historical background of Latino. The contemporary application also very critical. And then also, thank you. Thank you all. I'm sorry that I could not be present, but really enjoyed the Zoom presentation.
Thank you, and thank you all so much. Thank you. And David Anderson, would you like to come up, please? And yeah, that concludes the program, and then we're kind of segueing into the reception now. David